The signal came in at 3:14 in the morning, and it nearly gave me a heart attack. Not because of the sound. The receiver was set to silent. It was the light. That small, cold blue pulse on my desk that meant something enormous had just crossed the threshold of our deep space antenna. A ray, something structured, something intentional, something sent by minds that were not ours. I had been waiting 7 years for that light. Every person in the Deep Signal Bureau had been waiting. Some of us had stopped believing it would ever come. I was still in my chair, half awake, a cold cup of coffee sitting next to a stack of calibration reports I had been pretending to read. My name is Yale Dran. I am the director of Earth's Deep Signal Bureau, which is a fancy title for the person who sits in a basement in Geneva and listens to the sky. That night the sky finally said something back. I pulled up the raw data on my screen. The signal was dense, layered, and beautiful in the way that mathematics is sometimes beautiful. Not warm, not soft, but precise in a way that felt almost like music. It was not random noise. It was not a pulsar echo or a solar artifact or any of the 17 things I had trained myself to check before allowing my heart to race. It was a broadcast, a deliberate wide-range galaxy-spanning broadcast, sent on a frequency that our own theorists had once calculated would be the ideal choice for any civilization trying to reach every other civilization at once. Someone had sent a message to the entire galaxy. I spent the next 4 hours running every verification protocol we had. My deputy, a sharp and relentlessly calm woman named Claire Owens, arrived at 6 in the morning and found me on my third cup of coffee, staring at a translation matrix that was already 70% complete. She looked at the screen. She looked at me. She sat down without saying a word and started working. By 9 o'clock we had a working translation. It was a charter, a founding document. The kind of text that civilizations write when they have decided, after long deliberation, that they are going to do something organized and permanent. It declared the formation of something called the Galactic Conclave of Sentient Civilizations. It outlined principles of cooperation, mutual respect, shared knowledge, and collective safety. It listed the rights and responsibilities of member species. It described a governing structure, a system of representation, a set of protocols for conflict resolution. It was in every meaningful sense a constitution for the known galaxy, and it listed 312 species as founding members. Claire read through the list twice. Then she printed it out, which she never does, and read through it a third time with a pen in her hand. I watched her go through every name. I watched her reach the end. I watched her look up at me. "We're not on it," she said. I said, "We're not on it at all, no." She set the pen down very carefully, as if she was worried about what her hands might do if she did not give them something precise to hold. "They know we exist," she said. "We've been broadcasting for over 100 years. Basic mathematics, music theory, prime sequences, everything the textbooks say to send if you want to be found. They know," I said. So this wasn't an oversight. I had been sitting with that thought for 4 hours. It did not get easier to hold the longer I held it. The conclave had not forgotten Earth. They had simply decided, at some point in their deliberations, that Earth did not belong on the list. We had not been rejected exactly. Rejection implies that someone considered your application and found it lacking. We had not even been given that. We had been left off the page entirely, the way you leave off a footnote that does not quite fit the argument you are making. "No," I said. It wasn't an oversight. We brought it to the UN Oversight Committee that afternoon. I had expected a controlled reaction, carefully worded concern, the measured language of people trained to show neither too much alarm nor too much calm. What I got instead was something closer to a room full of people who had just been told the building was on fire, and were not entirely sure whether to leave or pretend they had not noticed the smoke. The committee chair, a steady man named Gerald Holt, who had been doing this job for 12 years and had seen most things, read through the translated charter 3 times before he spoke. When he did, his voice was measured, but his knuckles were pale where he held the document. "Have we attempted direct contact?" he asked. "We sent a response query 6 hours ago," Claire said. "We identified ourselves as Earth, provided our coordinates, and asked for clarification regarding our absence from the charter. And we received a response 40 minutes ago." She pulled up the translated reply on the room's main screen. It was short. That was the first thing everyone noticed. 312 species warranted a dense, layered founding document that ran to thousands of lines. Earth warranted 6 sentences. The conclave acknowledged our query. It confirmed that it had received our prior broadcasts over the past century. It noted that its founding criteria included a threshold of what it called civilizational relevance, defined by factors including interstellar travel capability, resource influence, diplomatic history, and what it referred to, with a phrase that took us 3 translation passes to render properly, as demonstrated capacity for sustained cooperative complexity. It stated that Earth had not, at the time of the conclave's formation, met this threshold. It wished us well in our ongoing development. It did not invite further correspondence on the matter. The room was quiet for a long time. Gerald Holt set down the printed copy. He folded his hands. He looked at me across the table with the expression of a man who has just been handed a problem that has no easy shape and asked what I thought we should do. I had been thinking about that since 4 o'clock in the morning. I had gone through anger, which felt hot and useless. I had gone through embarrassment, which felt even worse. I had gone through a brief, strange phase of wanting to write a very long and very articulate letter, explaining every achievement in human history, which I recognized was both desperate and beside the point. And then, sometime around 7, while Claire was working quietly beside me, and the sun was just starting to come through the basement window at the precise angle that made the coffee machine cast a long shadow across the floor, I had arrived somewhere unexpected. I had arrived at something that felt almost like amusement. Not at the insult. The insult was real and I did not pretend otherwise, but at the situation itself, at the idea that somewhere out there, 312 civilizations had gathered to organize the galaxy, had written their careful rules and their measured principles and their thresholds for relevance, and had looked at the small blue planet broadcasting prime sequences into the dark, and had said essentially not yet. And here we were, still broadcasting, still listening, still in the basement at 3 in the morning, running verification protocols with cold coffee and a deputy who printed things out when she was very serious about them. There was something almost funny about it if you looked at it from exactly the right angle. I think, I said to Gerald Holt and the 16 other people watching me from around that table, that we should avoid the instinct to petition. Several expressions shifted. One delegate from the East Asian bloc opened his mouth and then closed it again. They did not forget us, I continued. They considered us and decided we did not meet their standard. Asking them to reconsider puts us in the position of arguing that their standard was wrong, which they will not accept, or arguing that we secretly meet it, which we cannot prove to their satisfaction. Either way, we are playing their game by their rules on their court. Then what do you suggest? Gerald asked. I suggest, I said, that we do what humans do when someone tells us we're not good enough to come inside. The room waited. We build our own house. There was a pause. Then, from the far end of the table, a young aide whose name I did not yet know let out a sound that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. He covered it immediately with his hand. I caught his eye. I did not cover my smile. Gerald Holt looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked down at the 6-sentence reply from the Galactic Conclave of Sentient Civilizations, the most powerful organization in the known galaxy, which had looked at Earth and seen something not worth including. All right, Yale, he said quietly. Tell me what that means. I leaned forward in my chair. It means, I said, that we go introduce ourselves to everyone they left off the list too. Outside the window of that Geneva conference room, the sun was fully up now, pouring clean light across the lake. Inside, the mood had shifted, not to celebration, not to relief, but to something sharper and more interesting than either. Something that felt like the moment before a beginning. I picked up my coffee. It was still cold. I drank it anyway. We had work to do. The ship was nothing impressive to look at. The ISS Audacity was a converted deep-range research vessel, originally built for long-haul telescope deployment missions on the outer edge of the solar system. It had been refitted twice, extended once, and at some point in its operational history had developed a faint vibration in the port side corridor on Deck 2 that the engineering team called the hum, and had never fully explained. It had a crew of 41, a cargo hold full of compressed data archives, agricultural seed samples, medical reference libraries, and 17 different kinds of preserved food, because nobody could agree on what alien life might find interesting. And a mission profile that, when I had first presented it to the Global Council, had been met with a silence so complete that I could hear the ventilation system. The mission profile was simple. We were going to find every civilization that the Galactic Conclave had left off its list, and we were going to say hello. No formal demands, no political agenda, no attempt to position Earth as a rival power or an alternative authority. Just hello. And then if hello was well received, we are glad to meet you. And then if that went well, here are some things we know. And here are some things we would like to know, and perhaps we could be useful to each other. It sounded almost embarrassingly simple. Several council members had said so, in those precise words. One delegate had called it naive, another had called it dangerously informal. Gerald Holt had looked at the ceiling for a long moment and then said, very quietly, that he thought it might be the most honest foreign policy Earth had ever attempted, and authorized it before anyone could object further. I was standing on the bridge of the Audacity when we cleared the heliopause and the solar system fell behind us, reduced to a bright point among other bright points, indistinguishable from a distance. My pilot, a focused and steady man named Owen Park, was running the navigation checks with the quiet efficiency of someone who genuinely loved his job. My science lead, a woman named Nadia Frost, was at the long-range sensor station, already cataloging the first data returns from the outer dark. My communications specialist, a young man named Eli Cross, was at his console, running through the contact protocols we had developed over the previous 4 months. Protocols designed to be as open and non-threatening as possible, which had involved, at one memorably strange meeting, a linguist, a jazz musician, and a child psychologist all arguing about the best way to say hello to someone who had never heard the word. The Conclave Charter had contained, among its appendices, a partial registry of known civilizations that had been assessed and categorized. Most were listed as full members. A small number were listed as pending candidates. And then there was a third category, a much longer list, that the Charter referred to simply as unaffiliated entities, which was the Conclave's polite way of saying species they had decided were not worth their time. That list had 63 entries. We had cross-referenced it with everything in our own deep signal archives, matched known broadcast frequencies, identified likely positions, and plotted a route. Our first destination was a star system 17 light-years from Earth, home to a civilization our signals team had been tracking for 9 years without knowing what to call them. The Conclave's registry listed them as Vorkai. We had been calling them the Spore Signal because their communications were dense and rhythmic, in a way that reminded one of our researchers of fungal growth patterns, which turned out to be more accurate than she had intended. The Vorkai were, in the most literal sense, a fungal civilization, not in the way that word might suggest to someone imagining something strange or alarming. They were complex, structured, deeply intelligent, and had built a society of remarkable sophistication across the cavern systems of their planet and the orbital platforms above it. They communicated through chemical signal and sound, had a rich tradition of what could only be called philosophy, and had been broadcasting their presence into space for 200 years, without receiving a single meaningful response. The Conclave had categorized them as low priority due to limited resource capacity and non-standard communication modalities, which I had read 3 times and each time found more quietly extraordinary in its narrowness. We came out of our transit approach at a careful, non-threatening distance. Eli began transmitting on the Vorkai's primary broadcast frequency, using mathematical patterns first, then structured rhythm, then a slow and careful attempt at something approaching their chemical signal encoding translated into radio pulses. It took 11 hours of steady transmission before we received anything back. What came back was extraordinary. It was not the careful, cautious probe response we had expected. It was a full transmission, long-layered, urgent. Nadia and Eli worked through the night pulling it apart, and by morning they had the shape of it, if not the fine detail. The Vorkai had been watching our approach for 2 days. They had identified us as non-conclave. They wanted to know, with a directness that suggested they had been waiting a long time to ask this question, why the conclave had never responded to them, and whether we knew the reason. I wrote the response myself. I told them the truth. I told them that the conclave had assessed them and placed them in a category called unaffiliated. I told them that Earth was also not a conclave member. I told them that we had come not to represent any authority, but simply because we thought they were worth meeting, and because we believed that the category of unaffiliated was a label applied by others, not a fact about who you were. The response took 4 hours. When it came, Eli looked up from his console with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Something open and a little stunned. They want to meet in person, he said. They're offering to receive a delegation on their orbital platform. Then we go, I said. Owen Park set course. The hum in the portside corridor seemed for a moment a little louder than usual. I chose to take it as enthusiasm. The orbital platform was old and beautifully strange, a structure that had grown more than it had been built, layer upon layer of additions and modifications over centuries, each one fitting into the others the way coral fits into a reef. We docked through a flexible organic airlock that adjusted its shape around our hatch, in a way that should have been alarming and was instead oddly graceful, and then a door opened, and on the other side of it were 3 Vorkai. They were not what I had imagined. They were not what anyone had imagined based on the signal analysis. They were taller than a human and broader, with a texture to their outer surface that shifted slowly as they moved, and eyes that caught the light in ways that did not match any optical structure in our reference libraries. They communicated in sound and chemical signals simultaneously, and our translation system could only capture perhaps half of either layer, which meant that everything they said to us was, in a sense, already a translation of a translation. And yet, the first thing the Vorkai Elder communicated, once Eli had run it through every filter we had, was this: "You came. Not why did you come. Not who sent you, just you came." I told her that yes, we had come because we thought it was worth the trip. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that came through the system as a question about our intentions. But Eli, who had been working on Vorkai syntax for 2 days straight with very little sleep, said he thought the actual meaning was closer to, "Do you intend to stay interested? Or is this a visit that ends when you have what you want?" I looked at the elder. I thought about the conclave's 6-sentence reply. I thought about the word relevance and what it meant when applied to 300 years of broadcasting into silence. I told her that we intended to stay interested for as long as she would have us. She offered us something then, a dense, dark material served in a container that had grown rather than been manufactured. Nadia, who had quietly run a basic safety scan while pretending to consult her notes, gave me a small nod. I accepted the container. I consumed the contents. It tasted like something between charcoal and vinegar, with an undertone I could not name. It was one of the more challenging culinary experiences of my life. I kept my expression neutral with the help of 7 years of diplomatic training, and asked, through Eli, if I might have a little more. The elder made a sound that our system flagged as high register and non-standard. It took Eli another hour to determine, with reasonable confidence, that this was laughter. We spent 4 days with the Vorkai. We shared medical research. We shared agricultural data. We traded signal archives. Theirs went back 400 years, ours barely 100. And sitting in their library and seeing the depth of what they had recorded felt like standing at the edge of something very large and slowly beginning to understand its shape. They had been watching the galaxy for a long time. They had seen the conclave form. They had watched it grow. They had sent messages and received nothing, and over time they had stopped expecting anything different. They had not, in all that time, stopped broadcasting. They had kept sending their signals into the dark out of something that, when Eli finally translated the concept as precisely as he could manage, came through as, because the sky deserves an answer, whether or not it listens. On our last evening aboard the platform, the elder asked me again why we had come when the conclave had not sent us. I told her that we did not need permission to be curious. She made the high register sound again. Then she said something that Eli translated carefully, checking it twice before he read it to me. She said, "We have been waiting for something like you for a very long time, and we were beginning to think we had been wrong to wait." I did not have an answer to that. I just nodded, and looked out through the transparent section of the platform wall at the stars beyond, and felt the particular weight of a moment that you know, even as you are standing inside it, that you will not forget. We left the Vorkai with a formal exchange of contact protocols, a copy of their 400-year signal archive, a small container of the dark substance that I had privately named grief vinegar, and something more important than any of those things, the beginning of a mutual agreement to keep talking. Owen Park set the next course. The Delith Nomad fleet was 11 days out. Before we arrived, Eli picked up something unexpected on the long-range passive sensors, a ship, running quiet, positioned at a distance that was not quite observation range but was not quite anything else either. It had no broadcast signature. It was not running active scans. It was simply there at the edge of our sensor return, sitting still in a way that suggested it was watching without wanting to be seen watching. Nadia pulled the hull profile. She ran it against every registry we had. Then she pulled up the Conclave Charter Appendix, which included ship classification standards, and ran it against those. She turned from her screen and looked at me. "Conclave Observer Vessel," she said. "Long-range Silent Watch class." I looked at the sensor return. The ship did not move. "Let it watch," I said. Eli looked up from his console. "Should we signal them?" I thought about it. I thought about 6 sentences and the word relevance. I thought about the Vorkai Elder and the sound that meant laughter and the phrase "because the sky deserves an answer." "No," I said. "Let them come to us when they're ready." We were 11 days from the Delith fleet. We had, at last count, 63 unaffiliated civilizations on our list, of which we had visited one and found, against every expectation the Conclave's categorization had tried to set, Something worth knowing. I went back to my cabin, made coffee, sat down, and began drafting our next contact approach. The hum in the portside corridor had not gone away. I was starting to think it was not a fault, but a feature. I was starting to think a lot of things. The Deleth were not what I expected, and by this point in the voyage I had learned to stop expecting. They had been nomads for 600 years, not by necessity but by philosophy. Their home planet had been habitable once, and still was, technically, but they had made a collective decision 3 generations back to leave it, maintained as a kind of monument, a place to return to but not to live in, and had taken to the space between stars in a fleet of vessels that had grown and evolved over the centuries into something more like a city than a convoy. They were tall, narrow-limbed, and communicated in layered harmonics that Eli said felt like trying to catch rain in a net, which was his way of expressing that the translation work was extremely difficult, and he was doing it anyway. The fleet numbered 47 ships when we found them, ranging from enormous generation vessels to small, fast scouts that darted around the larger ships the way fish move around a reef. They had detected us 3 days before we arrived and had sent a series of short signals that Eli decoded as something between a greeting and navigation warning, which meant roughly, "We see you, please don't come in too fast." We did not come in too fast. The Deleth senior navigator, a person named Eris in our closest phonetic rendering, met us via long-range communication before we got within visual range. She was direct in a way I found immediately refreshing. She said that they had heard of Earth, not through the conclave, but through their own deep signal listening, the same broadcast we had been sending for 100 years, and that they had wondered about us. She said that they knew the conclave had not included us, because they themselves had not been included, and that they had long since stopped looking for an explanation that made sense. I told her about the Vorkai. I told her about our mission. I told her that we were not representing any authority or seeking any advantage, that we were just a species that had been left off a list, and had decided that the list was less important than the connections it had failed to make. There was a pause. Then Eris said something in Deleth harmonics that Eli rendered, carefully, as, "That is the first honest thing anyone from another world has ever said to us." We joined the fleet for 6 days. We shared navigational data, asteroid mapping surveys, stellar cartography going back to the beginning of our telescope programs. They shared their own charts, which covered regions of space our instruments had barely reached, and which contained notations beside star systems that Eli eventually translated, as meaning something like, "We passed here and it was worth seeing," which was the Deleth equivalent of a travel recommendation and which I found, for reasons I could not fully explain, one of the most moving things I had encountered in the entire voyage. On the 5th day, the sensors lit up. Owen Park called me to the bridge at IL 400, his voice level in the way it only was when he was working very hard to keep it that way. I arrived in 30 seconds. On the main display, the Deleth fleet's long-range data, now shared freely with us via the link Eli had established, showed a solar storm, not a standard coronal mass ejection but something larger and faster, a full-scale solar particle event from a nearby unstable star that none of our models had flagged because our models had not had access to the Deleth's local stellar monitoring network until 6 days ago. The leading edge of the particle wave would hit the fleet in approximately 9 hours. I looked at the data. I looked at Owen. He was already running intercept calculations. "How bad?" I asked. "The 2 smallest scouts are not shielded adequately," he said. "The main fleet can adjust and ride it out. Those 2 ships will lose critical systems. Life support would be at risk within 4 hours of impact." "How many crew?" 31 aboard the 2 scouts. I looked at Nadia. She was already on comms with our engineering team below. "The Audacity's shields? Rated for this class of event," she said. "We shelter the scouts under our shield envelope. We take on 31 Deleth passengers. We ride it out together." I did not hesitate. I turned to Eli. "Tell Aris what we see. Tell her our assessment. Tell her we are offering to shelter the scouts and their crew." Eli was already transmitting before I finished the sentence. The response from Aris came back in 90 seconds. In the background of the recording, Eli noted later, "You could hear the sound of the Deleth fleet's alert system, a low rolling harmonic that spread from ship to ship the way sound moves through water." The answer was yes. The scouts were changing course toward us before Aris had finished speaking. The next 9 hours were organized chaos. Owen held our position with a steadiness that made me grateful. Not for the first time, that he was my pilot. Nadia and her team adjusted our shield geometry to cover 2 additional ships without compromising core protection, which was a calculation that required 3 passes and a great deal of extremely focused language in the engineering channel. that I chose to pretend I had not heard. Eli coordinated with the Deleth scouts on approach vectors, working through their harmonic communication system in real time with a fluency that, under the circumstances, I found extraordinary. The 31 Deleth passengers came aboard in small transport modules. They were taller than our corridors were entirely designed for, and the Audacity adjusted to them in the fumbling, good-natured way that a ship adjusts when it was not built for a situation, but its crew is willing to work very hard to make it function anyway. We moved cargo to make room. We provided water, temperature adjustment, everything our medical reference library said Deleth physiology required, which was more than we had prepared for because we had not expected to need it in this particular way. The storm hit at 11:47 hours. On the external sensors, it looked like static from a broken screen, a wall of charged particles moving at a speed that made every instinct in the human brain say wrong, too fast, no stopping it. The Audacity shook. The hum in the portside corridor for approximately 30 seconds became something considerably more dramatic. Owen held course. The shields held. When it passed, every system on the 2 Deleth scouts was intact. Ariz called me directly. No delay, no protocol. Just her voice through Eli's translation, sharp and clear. She said, "You did not have to do that." I said, "Of course we did," she said. "The Conclave has a mutual protection charter. They have never activated it for a non-member vessel," I said. "We don't have a charter for this. We just have a ship with good shields and 31 people who needed somewhere to be." There was a long silence. When Aris spoke again, Eli had to ask her to repeat it, because the first time she said it, he thought he had the translation wrong. She said it again. He looked at me. She says, for a moment, the Deleth fleet considers Earth a recognized ally, not by treaty, by action. I looked at the external screen where the Deleth fleet was regrouping in the post-storm quiet, their ships moving back into their traveling formation, with an efficiency that came from 600 years of practice. And I thought about a conclave registry that had listed them as nomadic entities of limited strategic value. And I thought about 31 living people aboard of vessels that had just survived something it should not have survived alone. "Tell her," I said to Eli, "that the feeling is mutual. Something changed after the storm. Not immediately, not with any announcement, but in the days that followed. As we continued, our route and word of the rescue traveled through the communication networks of the unaffiliated species we had been visiting. Something shifted in how those first conversations began. Before, there had been caution, reasonable and understandable caution, the wariness of civilizations that had been assessed and categorized and set aside. After, there was still caution, but underneath it there was something else. Something that felt like interest, and in several cases, something that felt almost like hope. The Vorkai began sending regular transmissions to the Audacity, sharing updates from their signal archives, passing along information about 2 other unaffiliated species they had been in indirect contact with and thought we should meet. The Deleth fleet began sharing their stellar navigation data with every ship on our contact list, citing, in the brief notes they attached, Earth's assistance during the particle event as the reason for the disclosure. Eli tracked the ripple of it across the communication networks. At one point, about 3 weeks after the storm, he came to my cabin with his tablet and showed me a map of signal traffic. All the unaffiliated species on our list, connected by lines showing active communication, the network growing and thickening day by day. "We didn't plan this," he said. "No," I agreed. "The Conclave is going to notice." I looked at the map. The lines crossed and connected, each one representing 2 civilizations that had been sitting in the dark, separately, talking to no one, and were now talking to each other. "Let them," I said. Eli nodded slowly. He started to leave, then stopped. "The observership ship is still following us," he said. "It's been with us for 3 weeks. Still silent." "I know. Do you think they're reporting back to the Conclave?" I looked at the map of growing connections on his screen. "Definitely," I said. He nodded again and left. I looked at the map for a long time after he was gone. 3 weeks into a mission that was supposed to be quiet and careful, and modest in its ambitions, and we had sheltered a nomad fleet through a particle storm, built communication links between species that had never spoken to each other, and attracted a silent observer from the galaxy's most powerful political body, which was watching everything we did without once reaching out to ask what we were doing. I thought about Gerald Holt's face when I had told him we were going to build our own house. I hoped he was watching the signal traffic. I picked up my coffee, which was cold again, a persistent theme of my professional life, and drank it and looked out the small window above my desk, at the stars, which were the same stars that had always been there and were now, slowly and improbably, and without anyone having quite planned it this way, beginning to feel a little more like a neighborhood. The next morning, Eli received a transmission. It was not from any of the 63 unaffiliated species on our list. The origin point, when he ran the trace, was a relay station in deep space, positioned at a distance from any inhabited system that suggested it was designed specifically for communications that were meant to travel without being easily attributed to a source. The message was short. It used a translation protocol that matched the Conclave Charter's formatting exactly. It said, "The Galactic Conclave of Sentient Civilizations notes that the vessel designated ISS Audacity of Earth has been conducting unauthorized diplomatic activities within the territories of the Unaffiliated Entity Registry. The Conclave requests that Commander Yael Dran present herself for clarification of Earth's intentions and legal standing." I read it twice. Eli was watching me from across the bridge, with the careful expression of someone waiting to see whether the person holding a piece of unexpected news is going to fold it back calmly or do something more interesting. Nadia was pretending to read a sensor report. Owen was looking very intently at the navigation display. I pulled up the response terminal. I thought for a moment. Then I typed my reply. It said, "We were not aware that friendship required authorization. Please advise which form to file." I addressed it to the Conclave's official diplomatic channel. Then, because I am a person who believes in transparency, I CC'd every species we had met on this voyage, the Vorkai, the Deleth, and the 6 others we had visited in the past 3 weeks. I sent it. Eli made a sound that he converted, not quite in time, into a cough. Nadia did not bother to pretend she was reading her report anymore. Owen turned around in his pilot seat for the first time in 3 weeks, and looked at me with an expression that was doing several different things at once. "Was that," he said, "wise?" I thought about it seriously because it was a serious question. "Probably not," I said, but it was honest. He considered that for a moment. Then he turned back to the navigation display. "Next destination?" he asked. "The Ashan system," I said. 11 days. 6-limbed engineers who've been trying to get someone to look at their orbital mechanics calculations for 40 years. "Right," he said, and began entering the course. The observer ship on the passive sensors had gone quiet. I did not think it had left. I thought it was doing exactly what it had been doing for 3 weeks. Watching, recording, reporting back to an organization that had decided Earth was not relevant enough to include, and was now watching, with an attention that I suspected was becoming difficult to look away from, as Earth quietly went about the business of making a great many friends. The hum in the port corridor had settled back to its normal pitch. We had 11 days to the Ashan system, 49 more civilizations on our list, and a reply from the Galactic Conclave to wait for. I was not, for the first time since this all began, in any hurry. The message from the Galactic Conclave arrived 48 hours after I had sent my response, and it was, in its way, the most fascinating piece of political communication I had ever read. It was not angry. I had expected anger, or at least the formal diplomatic equivalent of it. The kind of language that states displeasure without lowering itself to the word. It was not that. It was also not conciliatory, not apologetic, not the warm reversal I had allowed myself, in one weak moment during a sleepless night, to imagine. It was something more complicated and more interesting than either. It was an invitation, not to membership, not even close to membership, but an invitation to what the Conclave called a preliminary status dialogue, which my team and I spent 2 hours pulling apart, and which we eventually concluded meant, "We would like to talk to you about what you are doing, before you do any more of it." The invitation specified a meeting location, a neutral waypoint station at the intersection of 3 Conclave trade routes, and a time 6 weeks from the date of the message. It asked for a small delegation. It said nothing about the 63 unaffiliated species we had now been in contact with, but the fact that it had been sent at all said everything. I read the invitation to the crew at our next full assembly. All 41 of them gathered in the Audacity's central corridor because it was the only space large enough for everyone, and I asked for opinions. I got them. Our ship's doctor, a quiet and perceptive man named Henry Lyle, said that he thought the Conclave was not angry. They were nervous. He said that in his experience, organizations that were genuinely powerful rarely became nervous quickly. When they did, it meant something had moved faster than their models had predicted. Nadia said that the timing was interesting. 6 weeks gave the Conclave time to gather information. It also gave us time to continue our route. Owen said nothing, but when I looked at him, he tilted his head toward the navigation display in a way that meant, "We have a choice about how we use those 6 weeks." Eli said that 11 of the 63 species on our original list had, in the past 2 weeks, initiated contact with each other through the communication network the voyage had helped establish. without any action from us at all. The network was growing on its own now, the way a garden grows once you have put the first plants in and given them enough light. I sat with all of that, and then I made a decision that I reported to Gerald Holt in a tight beam message that evening, asking for ratification from the Global Council. We were going to accept the invitation. We were also going to continue the mission in full for the remaining 6 weeks. We were not going to present ourselves at the waypoint station as supplicants, or as representatives of something small and eager to prove its worth. We were going to arrive as the organizers of the Outer Compact, which was the name Eli had quietly suggested for the informal network we had been building, because it was accurate without being aggressive. And we were going to speak from that position. The Global Council ratified it within 20 hours. Gerald Holt's message back was 3 sentences. The third one said, "Be careful." The second one said, "Be honest." The first one said, "Be you." I kept all 3. We continued the mission. In those 6 weeks, we visited 14 more civilizations from the list. Each one was different. Each one had been assessed by the Conclave as unaffiliated for reasons that, when you actually met the civilization in question, revealed more about the assessor than the assessed. There were the Ashan engineers, whose mastery of orbital mechanics was so advanced that Nadia spent 4 days with their technical team, and came back to the Audacity speaking in a tone of voice usually reserved for people who have just seen something they were not sure they deserved to see. There was a deep ocean species called the Marin, who had no space travel at all but had built a civilization of extraordinary philosophical complexity and had been communicating through water pressure signals for 3 centuries, waiting for anyone to recognize the pattern. There were the Solkai, twin sun-dwellers whose entire cultural framework was built around the idea that every relationship was a bridge, and who, upon hearing about the Outer Compact, asked only one question: how do we join? Not cautiously, not with reservation, just, how do we join? By the time we approached the waypoint station, the Outer Compact was not a concept or a mission profile. It was a real thing. 47 civilizations, including Earth, connected by communication links, sharing information, assisting each other with technical problems, occasionally just talking across the dark the way the Vorkai had described. Because the sky deserves an answer. It was not the Galactic Conclave. It had no governing charter, no hierarchy, no thresholds for relevance. It had instead something the Conclave had never bothered to design into its structure. The simple principle that everyone in it had been left out once, and no one in it would do that to someone else. The waypoint station was large. Conclave infrastructure always was. It had the polished, deliberate look of an organization that had been building for a long time and wanted you to notice. Our docking approach was processed efficiently, and we were directed to a berth considerably smaller than several of the vessels already docked there, which I noted and chose to set aside. The Conclave delegation met us in a conference room that was clearly designed to be impressive. High ceilings, precise light, furniture that was beautiful in a cold sort of way. 5 delegates representing 5 of the Conclave's most senior member species. Their lead was a being called Assessor Vel, a tall, slow-moving figure from a species called the Rethani, who moved with the particular weight of someone who had been important for a very long time. Assessor Vel opened by noting that Earth's activities in the unaffiliated registry had been observed with interest by the Conclave's monitoring services, and that the Conclave wished to understand the intent and scope of these activities before they progressed further. I said that the activities were not a campaign or a program. They were conversations. Vel said that they had the character of diplomatic negotiation, and that the Conclave had established protocols governing diplomatic negotiation between species within the Galactic Registry. I said that the species we had been speaking with were not within the Galactic Registry, by the Conclave's own designation, and that the protocols therefore did not apply. There was a pause. One of the other delegates said something in their own language, quickly, that the translation system only partially caught, but Eli flagged it for me later and it translated as, "She has a point about the registry." Vel said that the Conclave was prepared to consider a formal status review for Earth, which would assess whether we met the criteria for associate observer standing, and, if approved, would bring Earth into the official framework. I said, "We appreciate the offer," and asked whether the review process would include any recognition of the Outer Compact's existing member. Civilizations, Vel said. "The Outer Compact is not a recognized entity," I said. "It is recognized by its members." Another pause, longer this time. I looked at Vel across that beautiful cold table, and I thought about every species we had visited, every conversation that had started with caution and ended with something warmer. I thought about the Vorkai elders' laughter, I thought about 31 Delith passengers in the corridors of the Audacity during a particle storm. I thought about the Solkai asking, without hesitation, "How do we join?" I said. The conclave assessed Earth and decided we did not meet the threshold of relevance. We accepted that assessment. We did not petition for reconsideration. We went and spoke to the other species that had been similarly assessed, and we found that relevance, as defined by the conclave's criteria, was not the same thing as worth. We have spent 6 months building a network of 47 civilizations that were, by the conclave's own measure, not important enough to include. We would like to suggest, respectfully and without hostility, that the measure was wrong. Vel was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What is it that Earth wants from this meeting?" And I said the thing I had been thinking about since 4 in the morning in a basement in Geneva. Since the moment I had read 6 sentences and felt, beneath the insult, something almost like clarity. I said, "We are not here to ask for anything. We are here to extend an invitation. The Outer Compact is open to new members. There are no tiers, no observers, no relevance assessments. Every member has one voice and one standing. We would like to invite the Galactic Conclave of Sentient Civilizations to join the Outer Compact as a full and equal member, on the same terms as every other civilization in it." The room was very still. One of the delegates made a sound. Vel held up a hand. Vel looked at me with an expression that my translation system could not process, and that I read, in the simple human way, as something between disbelief and a much older and more complex emotion that I did not have a name for. Vel said, "You are inviting the conclave to join your organization." I said yes. "On equal terms, with the same voice as everyone else," Vel said. "The conclave has 312 members and has governed galactic affairs for over 2 centuries," I said. "I know. You would be a welcome addition." Henry Lyle told me later, when we were back on the Audacity and he was making the tea he always made when he was processing something large, that the expression on Vel's face at that moment was the most interesting thing he had ever seen on the face of any species, human or otherwise. He said it was the expression of a mind encountering something it had not been prepared to encounter, and trying to decide in real time what to do with the fact that it was not prepared. I gave the conclave our contact information and told them to take all the time they needed. We departed the waypoint station 6 hours later. Owen set course for home. The hum in the port corridor played its usual note. Eli was already tracking the response traffic from the Outer Compact's member civilizations, who had been following the meeting in near real time through the shared communication network. The Vorkai had sent 3 transmissions before we were even out of docking range. The Delith fleet had sent a single harmonic that Eli rendered as something between cheering and the sound the sky makes before it clears. I went to my cabin. I made coffee, which was inevitably cold by the time I sat down with it. I drank it anyway. I looked out the window at the stars. The conclave had 3 months to respond. Maybe they would say no. Maybe they would send another 6 sentences. Maybe they would design a new category and put us in it. Something between associate and full member. Something that let them maintain the idea of thresholds while pretending they had not just been handed an invitation by a species they had once considered not worth including. Or maybe, I thought, watching the stars track slowly past the small window as the Audacity found its heading for home, maybe something had shifted in that cold, beautiful room. Maybe Assessor Vel, who had been important for a very long time, had sat across a table from a human with cold coffee and a borrowed ship, and heard something that the conclave's 2 centuries of careful organization had never quite managed to say out loud. That worth is not the same as power. That relevance is not the same as value. That the best table is not the one with the most rules about who may sit at it. I did not know what the conclave would decide. I knew what I had built, with 41 crew members, and a ship that hummed and 63 civilizations that had been waiting, in varying degrees of patience, for someone to show up without an assessment. I pulled up the Outer Compact's communication network on my screen. The lines of active signal traffic filled the display. Not a map, really, more like a drawing made by light. Each line a conversation between 2 species that had once had no one to talk to. It was messy and growing and had no hierarchy and no thresholds. It was, I thought, exactly what it was supposed to be. I was sitting on a hillside in northern Scotland when the message came. It had been 3 months and 11 days since we docked the Audacity and stepped back onto Earth, and in that time I had done exactly what I had told myself I would do, which was sleep for 2 weeks, spend 1 week doing nothing at all, and then ease back into work slowly, at the pace of a person who had spent 6 months in space and had earned the right to sit in actual sunlight for a while without feeling guilty about it. The hillside was green in the way that Scotland is green in early summer. which is a very particular kind of green that has more colors in it than you would expect, and smells like cold water and earth and something older than either. I had a flask of tea and a book I had been trying to read for 4 years, and the sky above me was full of small moving clouds that did not block the sun so much as play with it, moving the light around the way a hand moves things on a table. My personal communicator was in my coat pocket as it always was, because I was not actually capable of leaving it behind even when I tried. It pulsed once. I took it out. The message was from the Conclave's official diplomatic channel, routed through the Geneva Bureau and forwarded to me with a single line of annotation from Gerald Holt that said only, "Read this when you're ready." I looked at it for a moment. I looked at the sky. The clouds moved. The light changed. I opened the message. It was long. Much longer than 6 sentences. It ran to several pages of translated text, and Eli had clearly spent a great deal of time on the rendering, because the footnotes were detailed, and the translation was careful in the places where it mattered and approximate in the places where precision would have lost the meaning. He had flagged 3 passages with personal notes, which he never did, which told me before I read them that they were worth particular attention. The Conclave's message opened with something that I recognized. From 2 years of diplomatic work and 6 months of first contact, as an institution clearing its throat. Formal acknowledgement of the meeting at the Waypoint Station. Formal acknowledgement of the Outer Compact and its membership. Formal acknowledgement, in the careful language of an organization that had not often found itself in this position, that the circumstances of Earth's omission from the founding charter had been reviewed. That review, the message said, had found that the criteria applied at the time of the charter's formation had been based primarily on interstellar travel capability and resource influence, without adequate weight given to other indicators of civilizational complexity. Indicators that included, and here the language became noticeably less formal, the capacity to build trust across unknown boundaries, to respond to need without calculation, and to treat encounter as an end in itself rather than a means to one. The message used the word oversight. It was not, the Conclave acknowledged, an oversight in the sense of an accident. It was an oversight in the sense of a failure to see clearly. The distinction, which one of Eli's footnotes explained had required considerable internal debate within the Conclave before being included, was not small. I read that twice. Then I reached the passage Eli had flagged first. It quoted directly the message I had sent from the bridge of the Audacity, 3 months ago, to a silent observer ship in a distant relay station. "We are not here to ask for anything." The Conclave said it had discussed that line at length. It said that in 2 centuries of galactic governance, it had received petitions, demands, appeals, threats, and negotiations of every kind. It had not, in that time, received a communication from any species whose opening position was that it wanted nothing, and had come simply to offer something. The Conclave said this had been, in its own words, worth thinking about. I reached the second flagged passage. It was a paragraph in the middle of the message, and it said that the Galactic Conclave of Sentient Civilizations had voted, by a margin that the message did not specify but that Eli's footnote described as unexpectedly wide, to accept Earth's invitation to join the Outer Compact as a full and equal member, on the same terms as every other civilization in it. I stopped reading. I looked at the sky. A cloud had stalled directly overhead, large and white and unhurried, and the light, coming through its edges, was the kind of diffuse gold that happened in Scotland for maybe 2 weeks a year, and was worth every other kind of weather to see. The Conclave had said yes, not to a compromise, not to a tier or an observer role or a special status with conditions. Yes to the Outer Compact. Yes to equal standing. Yes to sitting at a table that had no categories for who belonged. I went back to the message. There was more. The Conclave asked to open a formal dialogue about incorporating some of the Outer Compact's structures into its own governing approach, not a merger, but a conversation. It asked whether Earth would be willing to share the contact protocols Eli had developed for first contact with unaffiliated species, which was a request so quietly extraordinary that I had to read it twice to be certain I had it right. The organization that had spent 2 centuries assessing and categorizing the galaxy was asking the species it had once declined to include for advice on how to say hello. I let out a breath. Eli's third flagged passage was at the end of the message. It was a single paragraph, and it did not sound like the rest of the document. The language was different, less formal, more careful in a different way. The way careful can sometimes mean sincere rather than guarded. Eli's footnote on this paragraph said only, "I believe this part was written personally by Assessor Vell. I have no way to confirm this. The language suggests it." The paragraph said this. The conclave was formed on the belief that civilizational relevance was a fixed and measurable thing, a threshold that could be determined in advance and applied consistently. We have spent 2 centuries applying it. The Outer Compact was formed on no such belief, by species who had been measured and found insufficient, and who proceeded to demonstrate that the measurement was the problem, and not these species. We do not have a formal word in our governance language for the experience of being corrected by someone who never intended to correct you, who simply went about being themselves while the correction became evident. We are considering adding one. I sat with that paragraph for a long time. The clouds continued to move. The light continued to shift. Somewhere below the hill, a stream was running that I could hear but not see, quiet and steady in the way that water has always been when it is doing what it was made to do. I had not set out to correct anyone. I had not set out to build a political organization or change galactic governance or prove a point. I had set out because Gerald Holt had looked at me across a conference table and said, quietly, "What do you think we should do?" And I had said, "We build our own house," and that had seemed at the time like the only honest answer. We had built something. 47 civilizations, connected by signal lines across distances that our grandparents had believed were crossed only by light. The Vorkai who had said, "You came." The Deleth who had called us ally not by treaty but by action. The Ashan engineers, whose orbital mechanics calculations were now part of every navigation database in the Outer Compact's member systems. The Marin, who had been sending signals through deep ocean for 300 years and had finally, 11 months ago, received an answer that made sense. The Solkai, who had asked how do we join without a single hesitation, because the Solkai believed every relationship was a bridge and had already understood, in the way their civilization understood things, that this one was worth building. Eli had sent me a message earlier that week, separate from the official channels, just a personal note. He had been working on expanding the communication network's reach, and in the process had identified 4 more civilizations not on the original 63 that were broadcasting quietly into the dark and had not yet been reached. He wanted to know if I thought we should go. I looked at the sky. I thought about a basement in Geneva and a cold cup of coffee and a small blue light pulsing at 3:14 in the morning. I thought about being left off a list and the strange specific gift that turned out to be. I thought about what happens when you tell a human that they are not relevant enough, not important enough, not worth including, and how the very worst thing you can do, if you intended that to hurt, is give that human a ship in 6 months and a list of everyone else you also decided did not matter. I thought about the hum in the port corridor of the Audacity, which our engineering team had investigated thoroughly on our return, and had concluded, after careful analysis, was caused by a minor resonance in the shield generator casing that was entirely harmless and would likely be there for life of the ship. Owen had said when they told him that he had known all along it was not a fault. I looked at the conclave's message on my communicator screen. I looked at the sky. I looked at the message again. Then I typed a response to Eli. It said, "Yes, we should go. Start planning the route, and find me a ship with a good hum." I put the communicator back in my coat pocket. I picked up my tea, which had gone cold, of course it had, and drank it and looked out at the long view from the hill, at the way the Scottish summer light made the whole landscape seem lit from inside, gentle and ancient and not impressed by very much. Somewhere up there, past the blue and the white and the gradual darkening toward space, 47 civilizations were talking to each other, across distances that used to be silence. An organization that had spent 2 centuries measuring worth, was learning, slowly and genuinely and with what I believed was real effort, that worth and power were not the same size. 4 more signals were going out into the dark, waiting for an answer. I had a hillside and cold tea, and a message that the most powerful organization in the galaxy had just sent to a species it once forgot to include, asking please, if we wouldn't mind, could we show them how we said hello? I grinned. I couldn't help it. I picked up the book I had been trying to read for 4 years, found my page, and read the first line. It was a good day to be human.